Well, thank you, Alexis, and thank you all for joining us, and welcome to today's Institute of the Americas Energy webinar, perhaps our last energy webinar of 2013. But before we get into the webinar, I want to just take this opportunity to call your attention to our newly launched La Jolla Conference site, which we've revamped in advance of next year's 23rd annual conference set for May 21st through 22nd. And you can check out the revamped site at www.iamericas.org/La Jolla. And let me also remind you of the energy program site, which is www.iamericas.org/energy. And finally, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at @IOA_energy. And indeed, Alexis mentioned how delighted we are to have John Foreman on the line with us today and presenting Brazil's Energetic 2013, the topic of our webinar. John Foreman has worked for decades in the oil and gas business, and I'm sure is known to many of you, especially when from his time as a director at the Agência Nacional do Petróleo, or ANP, in Brazil during the Lula administration. I should also add here that we're delighted to have John as a webinar presenter because he's also known for never mincing words and always providing what I think is insightful commentary on issues regarding Brazil's energy sector. So I think we should all be in for a treat today with John's remarks and discussion after the presentation. The bottom line here is that we have a lot to talk about. Brazil has been a huge year, energy speaking wise, in Brazil. The year began with a drought. You saw the first auctions in the oil and gas and the upstream in about 5 years. Since 2008, you had 3 bid rounds this year, the inaugural pre-salt bid round. Only a couple weeks ago, the final 3rd bid round of the year, licensing round. All of these had different ups and downs and different elements associated with them, and that's what we're going to talk about and have John share with us today. So we're going to talk about Brazil 2013 and what's happened this year, and look towards the turn of the calendar for 2014. And I think we're all curious to see what 2013 means as the world and the spotlight of the World Cup shines on Brazil in the early part, middle part of 2014. So without any further ado, I just want to thank John again for taking the time. I've heard John present on many occasions in Brazil and here in La Jolla, so I look forward to his remarks today. They're always illuminating. So John, thank you. Over to you, and we'll be back with you at the end.
Hey, thanks, Jeremy, for welcoming Alexis and all those who are listening to me. So let's get started. We tried to organize the discussion for today based on the 2 bid rounds which took place in the year, based on the concession model, and then some comments on the pre-salt auction, which is done under a different model. Anyway, these bid rounds, which are required by law so that blocks may be offered for companies to explore, had not been done since 2008. So it was 5 years without any bid rounds, and there was a lot missing. So this year we had a handful of them, maybe too many. So the 11th and 12th bid round, they were based on the concession model, which is the model which was created by the so-called petroleum law from 1997. And then after the discovery of oil under this thick salt layer and the basins of Santos and Campos, there were a lot of discussions because the idea that was conveyed to the public was that what had been found was a sea of oil. So all you had to do was sink a pipe and it produced millions and billions of barrels of oil. The price of oil pretty high. This, of course, gave the population the idea that Brazil was now rich. We would be part of the rich countries that have a lot of oil in their economies. Due to that, the Lula government decided to change the rules. And exactly for the area where these these discoveries were made, the so-called pre-salt. The idea was that by doing this, the Brazilian people would receive more from the oil resources to be developed. From my point of view, that's not true, because what was envisaged was really not to distribute the revenues from the oil the way that was foreseen in the petroleum law and allow all of them to go directly to the federal government. I'll go a little bit more on that later on. Anyway, this year we had these three auctions, three bid rounds. Next hydrocarbon bid. It's not foreseen for next year. The date is unclear. It will have to be decided by the National Council for Energy Policy, maybe by middle next year. So the 11th bid round, which took place May 2013, was the largest one ever done by ANP. 289 blocks were set up for auction, of which 142 were awarded. This large number was due to the fact that, as I said, we had gone 5 years without any bid rounds. So the idea was to offer enough blocks to get a lot of people interested. Blocks were distributed across 11 sedimentary basins, and both onshore and offshore, 87 blocks onshore, 55 offshore, but none of them on the so-called pre-salt area. Okay, so we had 71 companies, including 16 newcomers, participating. 30 companies won bids, with 12 local companies and 12 companies of international origin. As usual, Petrobras won the greatest proportion, either alone or in association. The top 10 companies in the bid round in descending order were Petrobras, British Gas, OGX, Total French, BP British, Statoil Norwegian, Petroenergia Brazil, Queiroz Galvão Brazilian, ExxonMobil American, and Pacific Rubiales, which is basically Canadian in Colombia. We'll have a look now at the maps to see where the blocks were offered, both offshore and onshore. We chose to use this big map because it gives you an idea all over the country. So starting here, we have the areas offered in the very north part of Brazil. This is due to the fact that oil has been found in equivalent meridians in Africa, okay, and the parallels. So these were the blocks offered far north. Some discoveries on the Guianas here, but also a reason for that. Then they came to the Amazon Delta, which had been offered before, and coming down along the coast of the northeastern part of the country. And you notice that the offshore ends about here, which is north of the pre-salt area, which is down under here. Okay. Onshore, we had areas offered here in Parnaíba Basin. We had areas offered in Recôncavo, which is the oldest basin in Brazil. Sergipe Alagoas over here, but again, nothing on the so-called pre-salt area. This was considered as a very successful bid round. Lots of companies, as you notice, took part, and they won blocks. So this was really considered as a success. Now, if we go to the next slide, if I can. Next slide. We will deal with the Oops, went right to the end. Well, there we are. Okay. And then we had in October, we had the pre-salt auction for the Libre field. The government was very optimistic about this area being offered, and they estimated that you'd have a very high number of companies participating, and they repeatedly announced it, more than 40 companies. And in fact, only 11 did qualify to participate on these auctions. And there was only one bid presented, a consortium comprised of Shell, Total, CNOC, and CNPC, both Chinese, and Petrobras. And this offer was at the minimum price and with a minimum admitted local content. Well, this was certainly not expected. So the government has been saying that these 5 companies, they are all within the 10 largest oil companies in the world. So it was a success. It really raised a lot of questions. First of all, whether there was any competition at all. The fact that there was no competition can be seen from the fact that the minimum price for the bonus was paid and the local content was the minimum admitted. So it wasn't really that good. And anyway, Petrobras, which by law has to have at least 30% of any concession on the pre-salt area, raised its share to 40. Shell and Total had 20 each, and the 2 Chinese companies 10% each, adding 20% to a total of 100%. So competition was not the strongest point for this auction. This pre-salt has confirmed concerns over the role of local content. That's something that since the Lula government has been a lot emphasized, and the companies will offer very high local content percentages, which will be very difficult to attain on the one hand, and in order to attain them, probably the cost of the equipment and materials will be higher, as the costs of production in Brazil are higher than international prices. Now, the role of the Brazilian government is something which is under discussion again, because Petrobras, as it has a lot of its equity owned by private parties, it's not a state company. So they created another company called Pré-Sal Petróleo, PPSA, and this company is the one that will represent the government in the production sharing contracts. They will have the last word on any technical matters, and they overrule everybody, including Petrobras. They'll receive the revenues from the sales of the oil, and will transfer that to a special fund to be run by the federal government. Also, there's a grace ground between PPSA and ANP, which is the regulating agency, because under the joint operation agreement, the pre-salt company will take decisions that, when it comes to fiscalization, should be the role of ANP. So this is an experience that we have yet to see how it's going to work. The government made a lot of fuss about it. In fact, they brought this auction to October. It was originally foreseen for November, because they wanted to make use of the money from the bonus, which was quite a lot of money, to close their own accounts. And that was the main reason why the federal government was interested in this auction, and not on account of the oil to be produced, in fact. So in this slide here, you may see, although it's not marked, but this area here that comes from the north of the state of Espírito Santo right down to the limit of São Paulo and Paraná, in the deep and ultra deep waters, both in Campos and Santos Basin, is the so-called pre-salt area where the rules of production share occur. Okay? So the winning bid offered 41.65% of the oil profit for the union. Estimates are that there would be the need of 100 billion reais to develop the area. The estimates that the government has today is that 300 billion will be paid, billion reais again, will be paid in terms of royalties by the production in Libra. And the amount of oil to be recovered is estimated between 8 to 12 billion. And they think that production will reach a level of 1.4 million barrels a day by 10 to 15 years from now. Well, these are all estimates. There's only one well which was drilled there, so surprises may yet come into play. Going on to the 12th bid round, took place in November, and this theoretically was a bid round onshore, largely aimed at natural gas, both traditional reservoirs and basins, as well as unconventional resources. This was a way of Brazil trying to bring into play areas where you have this shale with potential for shale oil and gas. But the data for the unconventional resources is very, very restricted. So this didn't really raise a lot of interest. You had only 26 companies which qualified for the auction, but participating in the auction only 12. And of the 240 blocks which are offered, 72 were sold. Petrobras dominated the ground again, taking the stakes 49 of the 72 blocks. Of these 43 as operator, and the other companies, the other 11 companies, they had only 29 blocks to share among themselves. Among these companies, you have the Panamanian company Trayectoria Oil and Gas, and Colombia's Alvo Petro. These bid round, it raised concerns about the extractive techniques, because there's a lot of talk in the West and elsewhere about the potential danger for the environment, water pollution of aquifers, that sort of thing. And there's not a, as in the case of onshore blocks, the environmental licenses are given by the states and not by the federal government. Offshore is IBAMA. Onshore, for each state, they have their own environmental bodies, and those bodies are the ones who will give the environmental licenses to allow exploration to go on. And they are not prepared for that. There's not legislation to indicate what's going to happen, how it should be done, what should be the concerns about it, and so forth. So this is the questioning that is taking place, basically saying that this bid round was for unconventional resources was done much before the country was ready for it. These were the areas offered. Again, you will see that they are all onshore. Paraná, this is Parnaíba Basin, where you have blocks granted already. There's some production of gas here. But in this basin, only one block was taken up. São Francisco, no blocks were taken up. Parecis, no blocks were taken up. Acre, no blocks were taken. So you had a lot of interest in the Paraná Basin, these two segments which are offered, and the traditional onshore basins of Recôncavo in Bahia and Sergipe Alagoas. These are long time producing basins. This is where Petrobras concentrated its efforts, both here and Recôncavo, Sergipe Alagoas and Paraná. And probably due to the fact that Petrobras doesn't want to act as a lot of oil companies do when they have a certain reservoir that has reached the mature stage, they will farm it out. Petrobras doesn't want to do that, so that is the reason they will remain in these basins, because now in the same areas where they've been before, they'll be exploring for the possibilities of unconventional sources of oil and gas. So when we talk about diversifying Brazil's energy matrix and the role of natural gas in that, we have to take into account that the gas market in Brazil was developed from the gas imported from Bolivia. The gas pipeline was built from Bolivia, coming through central Brazil to São Paulo, and there with one branch going down to Rio Grande do Sul and one coming up north to Rio de Janeiro. So Petrobras today enjoys a monopoly over natural gas because although they don't own the pipelines, although they own the pipelines, it's operated by a subsidiary of it, Transpetro. There are no private gas pipelines in Brazil. They were all built and operated by Transpetro. The only very small exception is OGX, that had a small area up in the Parnaíba Basin, where I showed you before. They found some gas, and they're burning that gas in a thermal plant and generating electricity. As the field was quite near to the big transmission line, it was easy to get that hooked up. So 1230, we began with drought conditions that reopened debate over the increase of natural gas-fired power generation in Brazil. And during the year, we had all the gas-fired plants operating, which was rather unusual, because the way it works here, they only generate energy when there's not enough water. This year, they run the whole year through, and that meant an increase in the costs of energy. Second point is that tenders for thermal power generation have been complicated due to the constraints on natural gas supplies. What is that? In order to generate energy, you have to participate on a bid round which is promoted by EPE, the planning company. They'll determine the source of that energy, if it's gas, if it is coal, or eolic, or whatever. So when they have a tender for gas, those who want to participate must present contracts in which they are sure they'll have the gas to run the power plants for 25 years. So the only one producing and distributing gas in large amounts in Brazil is Petrobras. When these tenders take place, Petrobras will give the companies a non-firm contract, and they then apply themselves and they participate in the tenders, and for themselves they have, of course, a firm contract. So no companies really can find a way to participate in these gas bid rounds. So there's a lot to be discussed, because today in rough numbers, We import about 50% of the gas consumed here in Brazil, both from Bolivia and from LNG. For that, there are two terminals, one in Rio and one in the state of Ceará, which again belong to Petrobras and which again were built just to attend the specific need that Petrobras had there. So gas, although a very important source of energy, would need to have its general conditions uh, analyzed again, and new rules would have to be devised for it to be possible for private companies to participate. For the future, I very much like to say this is a Arab proverb. He says, "He who predicts the future lies, even if he is right." So you have this guy here, look at his ball. Nobody really knows what's going to happen in the future. Everything we can say, it's an educated guess, but I'm willing to discuss with you what I think about the future of Brazil. And thank you for listening to me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sean. That was wonderful. I think there's plenty of fodder for questions, and now we're at the part that I think everybody's really been waiting for, which is asking you uh, the more interesting set of questions. So let me just remind everybody again how to do that. I see a couple of people have posed some questions on the right-hand side of the page. You see a column, the little chat icon. You can either pose them in the chat box there. I see I've got a couple there, or in the question box, and I will just put those on the screen, and John will answer them in turn. So let me start with a question about the pre-salt round. John, we have a question here. How much control do you think BPCA will exert, and how big is the potential for conflict with Petrobras as operator?
It's a good question. Well, let's start by saying that the experienced people in oil in Brazil, they all come from Petrobras. Most of the people who work in the oil industry come from Petrobras. And when they retire, and they retire early because the conditions allow them to do that, they will go and work for private companies and so forth. So what you've got at PPSA is exactly that. It's former Petrobras employees who retired. President is a fellow who used to work in the research center of Petrobras, SEMPIS. When he retired, he did a stint of work at ANP, the regulatory agency, and then he went out and worked for a couple of private companies, and now he's the president of PPSA. The technical guys also are all ex-Petrobras. So they want to show that they are independent, and they'll try to direct Petrobras, and they have the power to do so because, as I said, on the Joint Operating Committee, they have the right to veto anything. So it's only with their approval that things go ahead. I see there is a good potential for conflict with Petrobras, yes, and some with ANP, because as I said before, again, some of the foreseen activities of PPSA, in fact, interfere with the fiscalization role of ANP.
Wonderful. I think the next question might actually be a little simpler to answer. We have a question just about the determination of the next bid round. So whether the date of the next bid round will be determined solely by CMP, or will it be in partnership with the ANP? So maybe a better way to understand is what is the role of the ANP in this?
The first Lula government, ANP did the studies and decided the dates for the bid rounds. The Ministry of Mines was informed, and there was no problem about that. Since Lula came in and Dilma was his Minister of Mines and Energy, she decided that they could only be authorized by the CNPE. So in other words, CNPE says if there will be or if there will not be a bid round. ANP prepares all the studies, proposes all the blocks, and then it sits there with CNPE as the 11th bid round stood for many, many years before the CNPE took the decision to authorize the bid round.
Okay. Thank you very much. The next question is about the pre-salt. Is the production estimate of 1.5 million barrels per day realistic under any scenario for Libra? These questions are ones I've received by email, by the way, so you can see my little logo there.
You see, at the stage we're in, we've got a well which was drilled in Libra, was very successful, very thick layer with production of oil, gas, 300 meters and so forth. So you can estimate if these conditions prevail, and the block is huge, if these conditions prevail in part of the block, then the resources there, which are in the order estimated 40 billion barrels. So when we say that the reserves will be 8 to 12, we're talking about 20 or 30% of the in-situ oil as calculated by ANP. So if these things do hold through, of course, if you have 8 billion barrels in the field, you could produce even more than 1.5 million barrels a day. So from this scenario, it's realistic. Now, the resources have to be confirmed, the reserves have to be calculated, the tests have to be done, and so forth before you can have a figure which will be realistic.
Okay, and another question here that we've just received. Will local content regulations continue to slow down production growth in Brazil, and when will local industry capacity catch up with demand? It's a big question.
That demands a big answer, because you have to understand the culture of the Brazilian industry. Brazilian industry in the past worked under the conditions of a closed market. It was a market closed to imports, and so price and quality, or even time for delivery, were not much of a concern because could only be bought here. And then they started changing that, and it was only what could be produced here and so forth. But anyway, then all of that was revoked. It was an open market for imports and exports. And when ANP came into being, companies would offer the percentage of local content they thought they could produce. It was with Lula that this became a fixed figure, the percentage that has to be attended. And if you don't, the fines are very, very heavy. Although the concession contracts having their clauses which establish that if the price is extremely high as compared to the international market, or if the delivery time is excessive, ANP could give a waiver for that. But when it comes to Petrobras, and Petrobras is the main operator, again, the government operates Petrobras, so they are told to do everything in Brazil, and that does delay and increase costs.
We have another question. I think this is sort of related, really. Again, there's been a lot of criticism about the competitiveness and the results of the bid rounds being related to local content and other steps. So what actions do you think the ANP will take, if so, to raise the competitiveness of the next bidding rounds? If you could talk maybe about pre-salt as well as the other rounds, that would be really interesting, John.
The only action ANP can take is to provide qualified information for the next bid round. So people looking at them will say, well, this is an interesting area, and we would be willing to spend money in exploration there. Because all the rest, really, the decisions are outside NP.
Well, can
Since
I
it's the
ask?
CNP that decides the local content, decides the dates, the number of blocks, and so forth. What
Well,
INP can do is gather data and have it properly prepared for evaluation.
can I ask a quick follow-up question then, as we take the moderator's prerogative here, and say, well, what about a little more broadly? What can the Brazilian government and the other associated agencies do in order to raise competitiveness for bidding rounds next year and beyond?
Well, as a whole, Alexis, I would say that the environment should be more welcoming to foreign investment. And
Mm-hmm.
this is something which has not really improved. In fact, the investment quality of Brazil is decreasing instead of increasing. So the government could work on the economics of the country to improve those conditions, reduce regulation, reduce taxes, and a number of things could be done. Oil itself, perhaps they could revise their own internal discussions and come back to only one type of rules for concessions instead of having concessions as such, production sharing and so on and so forth. Because one of the things that makes it a bit uncomfortable for companies to bid on is that the law that created this new production sharing system, it says that the CNPA may decide at any time that any other area, depending on the expectations you might have on it, may be declared also of interest, and so the rules that would apply would be the rules of production sharing and not of the concession.
Mm-hmm. Many big steps here. We have another question now about, I apologize, it's a bit small. I will just say, if you ask questions in the question box, there's actually a limit on the number of words. So when you ask them in the chat box like this one, we just get we get very small writing. So I'm going to read this out. It says, it appears there are significant challenges to develop. Yeah, this was about natural gas and the challenges to developing stranded gas resources onshore.
Yeah,
Could you?
that's absolutely true. For instance, if you go to Acre to uh, or to the other more, let's say, landlocked basins like Parecis, uh, to get the gas out of there is very difficult. Unless, as it happened in the case of Parnaíba, you happen to have a gas field which is not far from a transmission line, because then you can generate, and it's easier to transport electrical energy than it is to transport gas. You don't need the pipelines, okay? But it is a chicken and egg. And you see, the private companies were much more interested in Paraná Basin. Why? Because there's a huge market for gas there. And one of the companies that participated not as an operator is the gas company of the state of Paraná. In Brazil, the distribution of gas is a monopoly of the state companies, which can and do have private participations too. So in there, you have a market, and if you have to build a pipeline, probably will be a short one. And so it will be easier from the point of view of investment. Now, if you go to Parecis, anything you build is 2,000, 2,000, 3,000 kilometers.
Thank you. Sorry, I just got a couple of questions about the signal here. For those people having any problem with the signal, you can email me later and I can try and go over some of the things you might have missed. Also, this is available, the recording will be available so you can listen to it later. Sorry about that, John. Just a quick interjection there on technical issues.
That's all right.
We have another very long question here. Goodness knows, I don't know if you'll be able to read all of that. It says, Alexis, the road ahead for natural gas is difficult, yet Brazil plans to increase investment in natural gas. What do you see as the largest challenge to developing Brazil's natural gas sector? Is it Petrobras, logistics, lack of regulatory framework, low domestic prices? And what sort of time frame do you see before natural gas plays a stronger role? This is sort of a follow-on from the previous question. What
So
are the challenges? Everything.
From the end to the beginning because it's easier. Domestic price is not low at all. What is being paid here is something between $15 and $17 a million BTU. It's Japanese price. The regulatory framework is there. It's done. Okay. Now, logistics is a problem because all the pipelines, as I mentioned before, were built and are operated by Transpetro, and that is Petrobras. And although other companies may ask for the right to use these pipelines, Petrobras has a 10-year from the date the pipeline was built. They have a preference for 10 years. So building large pipelines is a big problem. Petrobras itself is not very friendly, as no company is will not be welcoming easily any competition. So if they can keep people out, they will. Now, the big problem on logistics was that these pipelines which were built to attend the demand existing at that time. For instance, the pipeline coming in from Bolivia has a very large diameter until it reaches São Paulo, and then it goes south. It's telescopic, so it's being reduced. Now, in the case you find gas in Paraná, you want to send it to São Paulo, you'll be limited because the gas pipeline there has a smaller diameter than it has in São Paulo. So it's not an easy solution. But I guess my opinion is that once you find gas in large amounts that will justify the building of infrastructure, that problem will be solved. Otherwise, you will need local solutions for that. And depending on the amount of gas, you can go to fertilizer plants, chemical plants, or if you want to transport, today LNG is possible to build smaller sizes facilities to export as LNG.
Thank you. I think we're going to switch over now to a couple of questions about Petrobras. Here, the first one is, just one moment. Our first question here is asking whether or not Petrobras is trying to bite off more than it can chew, particularly regarding already large debt levels in the company. A larger farm down strategy and more focus on larger fields would be a better approach.
Well, you see, Petrobras is a very large company, and in a very large company you have many different opinions, okay? So you still have in Petrobras, and this does find an echo with the government, those who think that the monopoly should be brought back. In that sense, they think that any oil or gas existing in Brazil should only be developed as needed for the local consumption, and no export should take place. Because if you export anything, you would be, in a way, jeopardizing the future of the future generations. Other part of Petrobras thinks like a modern company. They want to produce and sell while there is a market for hydrocarbons. because everybody realizes that the market for hydrocarbons is changing, has been changing, and probably in future, which is again very difficult to estimate when, uh, it will be entirely different. Gas is taking over oil. 30 years ago, gas was of no importance. Today, you have the shale gas. 10 years ago, you didn't have the shale gas, and so it goes. So within Petrobras, you have both groups with different opinions. Now, the big problem with Petrobras is not Petrobras itself, it's the government. Why is the government? Because the government is using Petrobras for its economic purposes and using the fact that they want to reduce inflation. They don't admit, for instance, that fuels have higher prices. So we command here prices which are lower than international prices. Now, this is absolutely crazy, but it is what it is. Some years ago, before pre-salt, Brazil was deeply involved with ethanol. We're going to be the Middle East of ethanol. Lula would say that. So a lot of plants were built all over the country, sugarcane plantations, technology available, technology is Brazilian, no problem. And now we've got the flex cars, which can burn gasoline or ethanol or gas, something you don't have in other places, but we have had it here for many, many years and so forth. Well, what happens? As the government will not allow Petrobras to raise the prices of gasoline or diesel, the price for ethanol became higher than the price of gasoline, so there was no demand for ethanol. Although in the gasoline, the commercial gasoline sold here, you have 25% of ethanol, that's not enough to, to use all the capacity that was built. The result is that many of the ethanol producing plants have closed down. And there's the area where sugarcane was planted has been reduced on account of the policy of not raising the prices of gasoline. So if you have a reduction of the amount of ethanol which is used, you have an increase in the amount of gasoline which you use. And that means that Petrobras had to import gasoline because the demand was higher than the capacity of the refineries here. So if you import gasoline, you import at international prices and you sell in the internal market at lower prices. And that means a loss. That's one of the big problems Petrobras has been having the last few years. So the huge debt is partly due to the fact, for instance, Petrobras raised a very large amount of equity about 2 or 3 years ago, 70 billion. And part of that was just burned to pay for the difference in prices in gasoline and diesel, which are imported and sold here at lower prices. At the same time, you killed or are killing the ethanol industry. So these things are the result of political decisions that are outside Petrobras, are in the government, Ministry of Finance and so forth, which are really damaging the company and damaging a lot.
Thank you. I had a second question here also about Petrobras, but maybe you've sort of really answered it. It was just asking again about what is politically possible for Petrobras in order to focus on these big projects. But I don't know if you want to sort of summarize that a little bit. But I know you talked a bit about that in your last answer.
I did, but it's always good to emphasize that part of Petrobras that wants the monopoly back, they don't want to sell anything. In fact, they will only sell outside Brazil, which Petrobras has been doing, selling its concessions in Africa, in the Gulf of Mexico, and so forth. So the decision to, what I said was that there are a lot of onshore fields, mainly in the old basins like Recôncavo, Sergipe, Alagoas, Espírito Santo, and so forth, that any, between commas, normal company would have already found out, to a smaller company that would be able to produce from these mature fields at a profit. And Petrobras doesn't do it. Why? Because roughly 80 or 80 something percent of its production comes from offshore at a cost today in the order of $12 to $15 a barrel. So if you produce at $50 a barrel, 1,000 barrels a day in Recôncavo, that doesn't even make a difference. So it's a political decision. Some people in Petrobras won't like, and the present government doesn't like the idea of allowing Petrobras to sell assets in Brazil, which they do outside, as I said.
Okay, I think we're almost out of time. I have one last question. I think it will be relatively easy or relatively swift answer. So I'll leave this as the last question, and then I just want to thank everybody again for being here this morning. Anyone who had any problems with the link, I apologize. The presentation and the recording will be available later. But let's just have the last question here. John, could there be a bilateral agreement between the US and Brazil on natural gas similar to its MOU on ethanol? And would there be any real benefit to this?
This is not a quick answer, Alexis. Come on. You've got Brazil involved in a phantasmagoric thing which is called the Mercosur. In the Mercosur, you have Argentina, you have Uruguay, you have Paraguay, Venezuela, and Bolivia coming in, and that sort of thing. So they want to do everything together. They are against bilateral agreements of any sort. The first agreement between the Mercosur to be discussed to the end was with the European Community, and now Argentina and Venezuela don't want to sign it. So I don't think there's not within this government or any government that follows the same type of politics.
That's what I thought you were going to say. So it's relatively easy there, yeah. Thank you very much, Sean, for your presentation and for answering all these questions. Thank you, everybody, for all of your questions. As always, insightful and high quality, which we appreciate. And I just wanted to quickly highlight a couple of upcoming programs. We are still confirming the time and date of our next webinar, but hopefully in mid-January we'll be talking about the oil sands and North American energy security. And then next year, on 21st, 22nd of May, the 23rd Annual La Jolla Energy Conference here in La Jolla. Again, you can visit our new webpage at www.iamericas.org/energy. And please follow us on Twitter at IOA_energy. I have been tweeting this webinar as we go along, and that's the best way to stay in touch with us. Again, thank you very much, John. It was wonderful. And Jeremy, if you have any final words.
I would just say thanks again to John for your insights, and listening to everything here, I couldn't help but be struck by something I saw in the energy reform legislation in Mexico, and it's very illuminating because it talks about the extremely interesting example on the upside of Brazil, but at the same time it talks about the recent let's call it bumps in the road that Brazil has faced in terms of the competitiveness of its energy sector. So I think we're going to look back on 2013, as John has talked about, and really have some questions, especially in the last couple of bid rounds this year. So that means we've got even more to talk about in the coming years, and we look forward to engaging with John and others on these topics down the road. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Alexis, for moderating.
No, not a problem. Thank you, everybody. See you next time. Happy holidays.